You see we have specified national powers and we have specified state powers. We also have what's known as concurrent. Basically, all that means is shared powers. We'll go into this chart a little bit more detail in just a minute, but this idea of federalism is this shared powers and specified powers between the national and the state level governments. Okay, so over here. Sovereignty. So sovereignty means the supreme and final governing authority. So a way that you could remember this, what word do you see in here? Sovereign, right? Sovereign means that they are the ultimate ruler, the ultimate rule, right? So because of that, that should help you remember it's the supreme and the final governing authority. So systems that apportion governmental power, meaning that they divide government power, okay? So what is the unitary system? This is where the national government is sovereign, meaning they are the complete authority. Governments you might see with this type of power, authoritarian, okay? So if you see that word authoritarian, I always want you to see that A right here, right? This A right here, think Adolf, okay? Adolf Hitler. He was an authoritarian dictator. Okay, so it's supreme rule. Then we have confederacy. So whenever you see this word confederacy, this is basically saying if you have states that are cooperating with one another, but they are technically their own sovereign territories. So we saw this as the case whenever the United States first came to be under the Articles of Confederation. We also saw this whenever the South seceded from the North. They all operated mostly as independent states, independent nations that were coming together. So a way you can remember this one, you think of the European Union, where you have very independent, right, European nations, but they are all under one entity known as the European Union. So they're working together, but they are technically independent from one another, okay? The United States has a system of federalism. So again, what that is whenever the powers are being shared between the national and the state government, but there are also very specified, very particular powers for each one. As the United States has gone along in its existence ever since it's been created, we have seen this definition really evolve. What do I mean by that? I mean that the governments and the powers that they have has really changed over time. So we've seen a lot more nationalization lately, which we'll talk about, which gave the government more authority, the national government more authority. But we've also seen a system of devolution, meaning that the powers went to the states. And in that process, the states became more independent. Okay, so it's changed a lot over time on how we really have separated the powers between the national level and the state level. So the argument for federalism, why did they put it in? So under the Articles of Confederation, the government was too weak. It could not create a military. They didn't have a central currency, meaning that each state had its own currency. So imagine that today, trying to go like to Oklahoma, right? If you go to the store, they would have had Oklahoma money and you would have had Texas money. That would not have worked out, right? That was the problem that they faced during that time period under the Articles of Confederation. The moment they went to a different state, it was a different currency. So there were many issues underneath that Articles of Confederation. So they created this system of federalism, which basically made it so that way the states still kept some of their voice. They still kept some of their power, but there was an ultimate authority, the national government, over the entire nation. Okay? So This is one of our systems also of built-in checks and balances. What do I mean by that? The states and the federal government, you'll notice from time to time, they start to butt heads. Okay, especially Texas in the United States. They really tend to butt heads with each other. This is a system of checks and balances. The national level government is checking the state government, but the state government can also turn right around and do the same thing. Okay, so this is meant to be in there to protect liberty, protect these freedoms, so that way the national government and or the state government cannot become too powerful, and to moderate that power of government. Again, making it so that way neither side can have too much power. Okay? So we have enumerated or expressed powers. These are powers granted to the national government in the Constitution. Basically, just a fancy way of saying the Constitution says that the government can do A, B, and C. Okay? There's 17 specific ones, including measures for a secure defense. That is referring to the Army, the military, okay? And then a stable economy. So that was in response to, remember, having those different currencies for each state under the Articles of Confederation. They wanted a central currency, a national currency, okay, which we have as the dollar today. And then they put in this supremacy clause. So the meaning of this clause, again, has changed over time. The extent of how this clause is really used has changed over time. But what it is that the national laws are the supreme law of the land. So a time we really saw this put into action was the Unions and the Confederacy whenever they went to war over the issue of slavery. Okay, we did have the issue of states' rights in there too, but everyone's really usually familiar with the issue of slavery, right? The Union versus the Confederacy. Basically, the Union was telling the Confederacy, you cannot have this institution of slavery. It is not humane. It is not what we want in our nation. And so they went to war over this issue. That was that practice of the supremacy clause, especially because the southern states were trying to secede, right? Trying to have their own authority. So the federal government was trying to make sure that they were the supreme law, not the Confederacy. So we have these implied powers. So basically this is something that makes it so that way the national government from time to time can state that they have a power that's not expressly stated in the Constitution. Okay, so it's something that they think the Constitution implies. And they justify this through the necessary and proper clause, something also known as the elastic clause. So think of it as, let's say they're trying to pass a particular law, but it does not really fall within the 17 powers. They're trying to stretch a rubber band from that law to one of those powers to make it relate to one of those powers, so that way they can do it. Okay, that is the elastic clause, the necessary and proper clause, the ability to be able to make laws that they see fit, that is justified in their view from the Constitution. Reserved powers is the state's powers under the Constitution. Okay, I'm going to go over this chart over here. I'll show you what this is. So this is the state's powers under the Constitution. It's protected by the 10th Amendment. So these say that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, basically powers that are not expressly stated in the Constitution, nor expressly prohibited to the states, meaning that the Constitution does not say the states cannot have it, are reserved to the states. Okay? Then we have this process of nationalizations. This is the gradual shift in power from the states to the national government. How can you remember this? What word do you see in here? National, right? So it's that shift in power to the national government. Okay? So this is that chart that I was telling you guys and showed you guys already, right? So this is our chart of federalism. Okay, so this part over here is what the national level government has specific power over. Okay? And then the state powers, same thing. Okay? So the national government has power over the national defense. When you see that word, those words, national defense, that is referring to the military. Okay, saying that the national government has express power over the military. Okay, that central currency, how we have a dollar currency across the entire United States, that is also under the national powers. The decision to print more money, to create more coins, that is a national power. Okay? The power over the post office, where we get our mail, right? Regulation of the post office, that's a national power. Foreign affairs, our relationships with other countries, that is an expressed national power. If you notice, we don't have our governors going to different countries, right? Trying to create relationships with different countries. That's the job of the president, correct? So because of that, that is a foreign affair, relationship with other countries job, okay, under the national government. Then we have interstate commerce. So I always tell my students a way to remember the difference, because you see interstate, right, and intrastate over here. Interstate means the basically when it involves two or more states. So a way you can remember this, I-35, Interstate 35, it runs along many different states up to the north. I-35 connects from southern Texas, from Mexico, all the way up to Canada. Okay, that is a interstate highway. It's more than one state, right? Two or more states. Intrastate is talking about just within the state itself. Okay, so help you remember that. Interstate, remember that highway running through two or more states. Intrastate, just one state. Okay, within that one state. So state powers have the power to charter local government, meaning that it has the power to create different cities, at one point different counties, whenever the states are first being built out. It has the power over education. We have seen the national powers reach over into this education category, that process of nationalization. Public safety, that's referring to the police department, also the highways. You know, you go through DPS, right, the Department of Public Safety, to get your driver's license. That is a state power. Registration and voting, the power to control how the people are able to register and how they are able to vote within the state. That is a state power. There are concurrent, meaning that there are shared powers. Okay? So there's this lend and borrow money. So the important thing to know here is that state powers, the states, can only borrow money from the national level. Okay? So they can lend, also they can lend money to the national level, which we have seen happen a couple of times with a couple of different wars throughout our history, where the states have given money to the national government to pay for different war efforts. The national government is the one that can borrow it from different countries. Okay, so the way you can remember this is that the foreign affairs, that is under the national power. So the national power can only borrow money from, the national government has the power to borrow it from foreign entities, whereas the state government only has the power to borrow it from the national. Okay, taxation, so you know, we have the income tax, right? That is a national tax. Okay, our state government does not have an income tax. In fact, they have passed an amendment saying that they are no longer able to even suggest having an income tax. But there are different states, such as California, that do have income taxes. So that is because they have the power to tax. Okay, both at the national level and at the state level. The way you see taxes at the state level in Texas, think of things like your sales tax, your property taxes. That is the state level taxing. Okay, law enforcement. So we do have state level law enforcement, right, like our sheriffs and those sorts of things. But we also have national level law enforcement, right? People like the FBI. We also have the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, right? That's the national level law enforcement. Okay, but we do also see it at the state levels, right? Things like our sheriffs, our constables, those sorts of things. The power to charter banks, makes basically saying the power to create banks. And then transportation. So why does this fall under this category? Because the highways that are strictly within state limits, intrastate highways, these are regulated by the states. But the moment that they cross over state borders, interstate 35, it becomes a national issue. Okay? So, ambiguities, meaning confusions, places that aren't quite clear in the Constitution have contributed to conflict between the nations and states, that interstate and intrastate commerce. Federalism has progressed through 3 historical eras. Okay, so that we have seen this process of what is known as the devolution, which is basically when the power goes to the states, and nationalization. Again, remember, you see that national, right? The power going to the national government, okay? So, one is 1789 to 1865. So, 1789, that is when our Constitution was created. Okay, when it was really put into place. 1865, that's the end of the Civil War. Okay, so we saw within this era 2 major conflicts that happened. One is the McCulloch v. Maryland case, which basically gave national power and the supremacy clause, the supreme law over the land. Okay, then we had and I'll put up in Canvas for you guys, overviews of these 2 court cases for you guys to use as a resource. I'll put it right underneath chapter 3. And then we had the Dred Scott decision in 1857. So basically this ruled states' rights in conflict over the legality of slavery. Okay, so the Civil War really solved this issue at this time of national authority. Remember that the southern states were trying to go against the national government, right? They were trying to challenge the national government's authority. So because of that, the Civil War really solved that issue once and for all, because the national government had won over those southern states. Okay? So, dual federalism and laissez-faire and capitalism. So when you see this word laissez-faire, remember that that means hands off, and that's referring to the economy, okay? And then capitalism. So dual federalism is a precise separation of national and state authority, okay? That's that chart we saw over here, very clean cut, who has what powers. Okay, so this was meant to keep it so that way the nation could operate harmoniously with each other, meaning that the states and the national government were not constantly butting heads with one another. Okay, so we also saw within this era the 14th Amendment. So this was intended to protect newly freed slaves from discriminatory action, because what the 14th Amendment did was it guaranteed that this guaranteed that all newly freed slaves would have their citizens' rights. Why was this important? Because up to this time, we had really seen any time someone's actions came into question, someone being who was previously a slave, they were not necessarily granted a trial all the time. They could be blamed for something and just executed on the spot, okay, without that actual process of going through the criminal justice system, going through that actual process of having that trial by jury. So this 14th Amendment made sure that anyone who was a citizen within the United States, and it is important to note that if they are a citizen of the United States, has the right to this 14th Amendment. Okay, we did see this extension later of the 14th Amendment to those who came into the United States who were not citizens, but it was not until later. This was the first step in really giving people, no matter what the color of their skin, the opportunity to be able to have a free trial or fair trial, so on and so forth. Okay, so over here we go. Okay, so dual federalism and laissez-faire capitalism. So remember 1865, this is whenever the Civil War had ended. That's the 14th Amendment that passed right after that, to 1937. Remember, this is the tail end of the Great Depression. Okay, almost right before the United States enters. The United States enters the World War II, 1941. So it's right at the tail end of that Great Depression. So after the Civil War, the Supreme Court gave nearly free rein to business. Okay, so the Constitution's Commerce Clause, meaning things having to do with trade, things having to do with business, that so on and so forth, gives Congress the power to regulate commerce, meaning regulating trade among the states, but does not spell out activities included in the grants of power. What does that mean? Basically, at this time, we saw Congress being able to regulate things that involved trade. So they were able to regulate railroads to a certain extent during this time period to allow farmers and those sorts of people to be able to transport their goods and that sort of thing, the trade, right? But they were not able to regulate business. Remember, this is whenever we saw during the Gilded Age those big monopolies, be it Rockefeller with oil, Carnegie with steel. That was whenever we were seeing unions really starting to rise up for workers' rights and those sorts of things. So the United States had decided that Congress could regulate the trade, but they could not regulate the actual business itself. Okay, which is why we saw the big monopolies and trusts and those sorts of things really start to develop during this time. National authority ultimately prevailed as the Supreme Court approved Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal economic and social program. So why was this a big deal? So Franklin Delano Roosevelt, remember he was president during the Great Depression. The Great Depression, there was a lot of issues going on, right? Huge unemployment rates, people out of their houses, so on and so forth. So Franklin Roosevelt created this plan to be able to get out of the Great Depression, but it was a big deal because he was one individual, right? And he was a president, not a member of Congress. And so because of that, he was creating all this different legislation that the Congress ultimately passed, but he was the one coming up with it himself. So because of that, he was stepping out of the traditional role of being the president, okay, and really exercising that national authority. So they also decided during this time that the industrial economy is not confined by state boundaries and must be subject to national regulation. So after all of the issues that happened in the early 1900s under the Gilded Age with those trusts and everything, it was decided during this time period, a period of nationalization, right, because we're seeing national authority prevail, that the national government would have the power to regulate industry. Why? Because they were protecting people's rights. They were protecting workers' rights, okay? So dual federalism is no longer an accurate description. So why is this? So we saw a long-term expansion of national authority, okay, since 1937. Things like World War II, the Red Scare that happened in the 1950s, the national level of government really exercising their authority to try and keep out the communist threat, right? But then, during this period, right around the 1980s, we really saw the process of devolution happen, which is whenever the national level government starts to hand the powers back to the state governments. Okay? It peaked in the 1990s. If you remember in the 1990s, I don't know if some of you were born yet, in the 1990s, this was known as the Republican era. So the Republicans had a lot of power within this time. What do Republicans really support as part of their platform? They like a weaker government. Okay? So because of that, the national level government really saw their power being slowly taken away, and it was handed back to the states themselves. Okay? But why did it say it peaked in the 1990s? Let's think about what happened in 2001. Right? That was September 11th attacks, right? So 2001, when the national government felt threatened, when we had that huge threat of terrorism within our country, the national government all of a sudden took back a huge portion and I'll put this PowerPoint on Canvas for you guys too. The national government takes back a huge portion of their power. Okay? So we really saw this through the Patriot Act, okay, which gave the national government a huge amount of power. Okay, why do I say that? People's rights were taken away in this Patriot Act. It took away, if you were a suspected terrorist, you could be held indefinitely without trial. Okay, that's a huge infringement on people's rights, right? But that shows you that through the September 11th attacks, our national government became very powerful. And we have not really seen a huge change whenever it comes to national security. Okay, they still pretty much have a lot of those powers still within our government today. It's still a very nationalist government today. Okay, so cooperative federalism. This is shared policy responsibilities. Okay, so this is the national, the state, and the local levels all working together. We see this through joint funding, administration, and determination of programs. So, for example, Medicaid. Medicaid is regulated at the national level, but it is the responsibility of the state governments to actually handle the administration, meaning the giving of Medicaid to the people. So the states are responsible for the administration of Medicaid to the people. Okay, this benefit. We also see it in things like WIC, Medicare, food stamps, those sorts of things. Okay, we have retained traditional authority in certain areas like education. So to a certain extent, our state still has power over education, which they usually hand down to the school districts, right? Over health, states have largely been responsible for how they were going to handle the coronavirus. And that is an illustration of the state's power to really regulate the health issues within its borders. Public safety, so there's different laws, right, whenever it comes to how to obtain your driver's license and that sort of thing within state borders. And then also the maintenance of roadways. How are they going to take care of their roads? So a way you can remember the roadway power, think of how long it's taken the state of Texas to finish 35. Think about that for a second. It's almost constantly under construction, right? Reason being is because Texas operates on a balanced budget, meaning that if it runs out of money for that fiscal year, meaning if it runs out of money for its budgeted year, then that's that. And we do not start operating again until the next fiscal year. So you notice that there's a certain part of the year where everybody has abandoned the construction projects, right? That is because of that balanced budget of Texas, and that is the state's regulation of the roadway, okay? So government renews and intergovernmental relationships. Remember that? Intergovernmental meaning between two or more governments, okay? So fiscal federalism. So remember that fiscal relates to money, okay? So this is federalism having to do with money, okay? So this is federal funds that are used for state and local programs. We have three different types. Grants and aid, which is basically cash payments to the states and localities, meaning cities, okay? Federal funds restricted to certain state programs under the categorical grants, and our block grants. So these are federal government funds for state programs addressed to a certain concern. So grants and aid, basically this can be a grant given by, so this is money given by the federal government to the state governments. Okay, these are not very limited on their use, right? So the state can use them for how they feel fit for use of the state. The money is a grant, okay? So remember, there's a difference between grants and loans. Grants, right, when you see if you're financial aid, you don't have to pay those back, right? So that is money that the national government is giving the state level government that they do not have to pay back, okay? Different from a loan. Categorical grants. These are federal funds that are restricted to a certain state program, okay? So this is money given to a state government for a specific purpose. Okay, so example, Medicaid. If the federal government gives Texas money for Medicaid as a categorical grant, that means that Texas cannot spend that money on anything but Medicaid. Okay? And then we see federal funds addressed to a certain concern. So both of these grants and aids, these block grants, these are used whenever states feel like they have a certain need. So grants and aid, we saw this with the coronavirus that happened, right? Texas really needed money to help out with the coronavirus. Block grants. So say Texas is noticing an issue with, let's say, we'll say an issue with highways being unsafe to travel, okay? We'll say there's a lot of potholes and questionable bridges, meaning questions about whether bridges are actually safe, okay? They can get money through the federal government to address these issues, okay? If they can convince the federal government to give them the money. So, federal government raises as much tax revenues as do all the state and local governments combined. Okay, so this is showing you a graph here. Whenever you take the federal government and you compare it to the state governments and these local governments and how much taxes they take, the federal government has a huge amount of taxes that they take compared to these two. Okay, the federal government is at 65% of these revenues, the state at 20%, and a lot of these state revenues would be represented by places like California, where they tax a little bit more. Texas, not so much, because they're a very low tax state. And then local governments, those are the city taxes that you might see. Okay, so over here, how the 50 states differ. Federal grants and aids to the states. So I'm going to give you a second to look at this map, over here. This is as a percentage of the state revenue of these grants and aids to the states. Remember, that's free money the federal government is giving to the states for general issues. So this yellow is 35% or more. The green is 30 to 34.9%. And the purple is 30% or less. I'm going to let you look at that for a second. So what we can really notice from this, guys, right, is that a majority of the states do take some kind of assistance from the national government, right? 30 to 34.9%, 35% or more, right, over here. However, whenever you do think about that as a percentage of the state revenue, it's still not a whole bunch, right? Even these states says 35% or more. That means that 65% of their state revenue, meaning 65% of their income that they use for state purposes, is coming from the citizens, right? Very interesting whenever you think about it, right? It means those property taxes, those sales taxes, all those different things, those taxes you pay whenever you're buying things like alcohol, cigarettes, whenever you're getting your driver's license, all those fees, so on and so forth. That's all going to the states to use, right? So the states do take some money from the federal government, but as a percentage of their whole entire income, it's really not that much whenever you think about it, right? So devolution. Remember that is the power being taken from the national to the state level government. Okay, so this is whenever the national government is giving power back to the state government. Okay, so it's the idea that American federalism can be strengthened by that shift in power. Okay, and again, remember we see very much throughout our history devolution and nationalization happening back and forth, back and forth. It's a constant process. So devolution, that's that weaker national government, right? That is more supported by Republicans. The process of nationalization is more supported by Democrats. Okay, and again, I will attach this annotated PowerPoint for you guys onto Canvas. Okay, so Democrats support more of that nationalization, that more powerful national government. Okay, so this process of devolution, we saw a sweeping change with the Welfare Reform Act passed in 1996, basically making it more difficult, more stringent categories on how you can apply for and qualify for welfare. The movement waned, though, with the attacks of 9/11. Okay, once those attacks of 9/11 happened, remember over here in the 1990s, that's whenever the Republicans were really in power. Republicans really valued this source of devolution, giving the states the power, right? But once 9/11 happened, we saw a huge, huge growth in nationalization. How can you remember that? So 2001, remember our president was George W. Bush. What party was he under? The Republican Party, right? But Republicans traditionally value devolution. That's a weak national government, right? But that Patriot Act, giving the national government all of those overreaching abilities, especially illustrated by the government's ability to keep, if you're a suspected terrorist, keep you with an indefinite amount of time with no trial by jury, right? That is a huge power of nationalization, a huge power of the national government. And that was passed under George W. Bush, who was a Republican. Okay, so that should give you an idea of how influential that event was on our government and how they operate. Okay? And then we also saw, so the Department of Homeland Security, you remember that those are the ones who usually protect the national borders. They are the ones who usually handle terrorist threats and that sort of thing. And with the passage of the Affordable Care Act in 2010. So remember that really took healthcare into the national level's hands. Okay, that was another process of nationalization under this Affordable Care Act. Okay, so last but not least, so we have seen, again, it's ever evolving, it changes throughout time. The changes in federalism, that process of nationalization and devolution throughout our history. Okay, so 3 major events, and I'm going to add that 4th one with 9/11. Roosevelt's New Deal, that was passage of nationalization. Okay, giving the government more power to handle that issue of the Great Depression. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, this was an extension of the New Deal. Okay, this is what created those social programs. This New Deal set the stage for things like Social Security that were created during this time. The Great Society under Lyndon B. Johnson, there we go, really extended this, because this is whenever we saw the extension of social services through things like Medicaid, through food stamps, so on and so forth. The Republican Revolution, which basically rolled back federal authority. Remember, Republicans tend to value devolution, giving this power back to the states. So in the 1990s, we really saw that start to happen. But in 9/11, that is again whenever we saw the process of nationalization. Okay, and I will label this for you guys so that way, whenever you're looking over this PowerPoint later, you can have this for your reference. Okay, so that is it for today. Remember that you have the